Leviticus 19 to 23 today. I know I promised we were going to rush through the rest of Leviticus, but actually I've stumbled across some really good stuff in this bit. There's quite a lot of it though, so I'm going to do a quick flip through just a few minor interesting points, then we'll come back to one of the key ones and have a bit of a slightly deeper look at that before we move on. I'm going to go high tech again and just read through these and just for simplicity. God says, do not swear falsely by my name, which I wonder if it gives us a little bit of an insight into what blasphemy is. It was difficult to figure out what that was earlier on. But it seems like if you say, oh, I'm going to do this, I swear to God, and then you don't do it, that would seem to be a blasphemous type of thing. Do not curse the deaf or put stumbling blocks in front of the blind. Even Adolf Hitler on a bad day, you can't envisage him shoving things in front of blind people, trip them up and having a giggle about it, can you? So what kind of person would you need to be for that to need to be said? I don't know, just that stood out a little bit. God says, fear your God. Literally, fear your God. It seems like an odd thing to want from your people. It's not very parental, is it? Or it's not very parental now. Maybe it was parental back then, or maybe it's an interesting one anyway. I just thought it's a little disappointing. Don't particularly want to fear this chap who's supposed to be a loving God and all the rest of it. Love your neighbour as yourself. Very interesting. We'll come back to that one. Although a slightly amusing bit there was, actually I'm going to read this. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I am the Lord. He says I am the Lord a lot here. Then a little bit, keep my decrees, fair enough. Then another little bit, same breath basically. Do not make different kinds of animals. So you have this deeply profound truth of humanness stuff. And then straight into labradoodles, not okay. It's just some of the weirdness of this whole book, I guess. There's some more weirdness in the sense of men must not clip the size of their hair or the size of their beards. Weird enough. Tattoos, not cool, not allowed. Don't make your daughter a prostitute. I mean, yeah, okay. Anyone sacrificing their child to Molech, this pagan god I think that we talked about briefly before, is going to get stoned. I think, however, this means stoned in the sense of where people throw rocks at you until you are dead, not the other kind of stone. So clearly this is not a good thing. But it does seem to allude to the idea that this is the next mention of this Molech chap. It's almost like it's suggesting that he does actually exist and he's a rival god, which I assume is not what's being said at all, but it's coming across a little bit like you could interpret it that way. In the case of adultery, both adulterers are put to death. So it's interesting that all the rules largely have been aimed at the men. So now women have got a rule too, but they get put to death for it. So great. Basically, everything that was prohibited in the previous list we did in terms of who you can't go to bed with, almost all instances of that you get killed for. There's another interesting point in that we talked earlier about God was going to drive out the people who are currently in the promised land to make room for the Israelites. And I didn't like the idea that just feels a little bit like God's people and these other folks. And it's, I don't know, it just feels favouritism and weird. But God does say that those people in the land of Canaan already are doing all of these things. So it sounds like it's a pretty messed up bunch. So it makes you wonder, actually, is it just a case of God has tried with everybody, but everyone's just being total punks everywhere, and the Israelites are the best of a bad bunch, so he's sticking with them. There's a couple of rules on priests, one of them being that priests aren't allowed to become unclean in the discharge of their duties unless it's linked with a family member. And you can sort of understand in something like the bubonic plague, for example, in the 1300s-ish. Apparently a lot of clergy were disproportionately said to have died because they were trying to help people, going around doing their bit. And you can understand in that sense that, yes, okay, priests, don't put yourself in harm's way because you've got other things you need to be doing. But it's talk about uncleanliness in the biblical terms. It's also, you've got a runny nose or something, or you've touched a carcass or entered a house where there's a dead body or something. So it seems to allude to some sort of aloofness from the clergy. But with my background, having grown up in a vicarage-ish, I've known lots of vicars, they were all great people helping people in their time of need. There's no way they were going to not go and help someone if they were unclean. So it's very odd and clearly not of its time, or rather that is of its time, and it's not how it seems to be done now as far as my experience is. There's also for priests the mention that it actually specifies that they can get married. There is a restriction on whom they can marry, but where the Catholic notion that priests have to be celibate comes from, I don't know. And it seems like that adds an extra problem that even the book of Leviticus, with all its boring rules, doesn't force them into. There's a crap bit too in terms of God saying that anyone with any deformities can't bring their sacrifice to the tabernacle and do their bit. And it's not like it's someone who's got COVID or something and there's something contagious is going to come along. It is just that, if you're blind or you're deaf or you've got a deformed foot, you can't come and do it. It just seems like blatant discrimination against people who would otherwise be perfectly fit to come and do their sacrifice. I don't quite know what's going on there. Anyway, the most interesting point I thought of this was going back to this love your neighbour as yourself. As I said previously, I thought that was one of the 10 Commandments. Then it turned out, no, it's not one of the 10 Commandments at all. So I thought, okay, probably Jesus said it then, which would make some sense, because my understanding is that Jesus was quite a cool dude, however you look at it. And this God of the Old Testament, he's setting fire to people and stuff like that. So it doesn't sound like the sort of thing he would say. But there it is, in the middle of Leviticus and all these dowdy rules, and if you do this, you're going to be burned to death, and do that, you're going to be put to death, and if you go to Sodom and Gomorrah with a donkey, even the donkey's going to be put to death. Love your neighbour as yourself. And it occurred that feels like actually that's two imperatives, because the rule would be intact if he'd just say, love your neighbour. The as yourself is sort of redundant almost, unless it's two rules. So you've got love your neighbour, part 1, as yourself, part 2. So it suggests you need to love your neighbour and you need to love yourself. The idea that, if you really think about it, do most people treat themselves in a way as if they were worthy of love, or if they were responsible for themselves as you might be for someone you're in charge of, an elderly relative or a sick person or a child or whatever it is? Do most people actually treat themselves the way they would, being their best selves, treat someone they were responsible for? And you think the answer is probably no, in terms of silly things like not getting enough sleep, or not getting any exercise, or eating too much, or smoking, or drinking, or being too hard on themselves, that sort of thing. I thought that was a really interesting point, that it seems to be God saying you're supposed to love yourself as well. And I guess it also relevant to that is, what does it mean by love? Because love is obviously a very big word. And my neighbours are wonderful here. They invite me over for Christmas. They work at breweries. They bring me beer. It's fabulous. You should totally get my neighbours if you can have a chance. But I don't love them, in the sense that the big meaning of the word love and all the rest of it. So I assume it doesn't mean literally your neighbour, and I assume it doesn't mean love in the fuzzy feeling sense, more in the behave in a loving way towards them. So yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting part, that, and it seems completely out of keeping with the rest of Leviticus. Do this, don't do that, and you're going to be killed, and set fire to your priest in front of the dad, and all the rest of that. And then suddenly just comes this, just love your neighbour and yourself, and it's like, yeah, I can work with that. And the idea occurs that is it potentially like we need to sieve it. So you put in all the stuff, and within the sieve stays the stuff that is of its time, all the ritual and ceremony and stuff that makes not much sense now. And then what comes through is the universal, timeless truths, basically to be excellent to each other. And we can disregard the bits that don't really fit our time anymore, because society has moved on a little bit and become somewhat more civilised than needing rules to say, don't go to bed with your donkey. But yeah, that's, I thought that was my favourite bit of Leviticus so far. There's suddenly a huge download of interesting stuff in one little bit. Next up, we have got a little bit on some more boring stuff. We're going to whiz through that. Then there's some interesting bit in terms of reward. We're going to have a blasphemer put to death, so probably do some complaining about that. And then it's the end of Leviticus. So that's it. We are very nearly there now.